Usually when we think about migration, we picture people, right?
Absolutely. Crowds crossing borders.
Right, looking for a better life. But right now, at this very moment, there is a massive invisible migration happening right under our noses. And, it's not people moving.
No, it's not.
It's the very factories, the assembly lines, the highly specialized machinery, and the incredibly complex supply chains that essentially build our modern world. They are rapidly packing up and shifting out of China. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a phenomenal physical and economic shift. I mean, we're watching the tectonic plates of the global economy physically separate and reform in real time.
It's wild to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's happening at a pace that is completely restructuring how things are made, bought, and sold across the entire planet.
And understanding the mechanics of that shift is really our core mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking a huge stack of international reports for you today.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot of data.
We really do. We're looking at a comprehensive CAMA economic working paper on the price effects of the U.S.-China trade wars. We've got strategic analyses from the Yetkin report and Anadolu Ajansı.
Right, and the trade data from Bloomberg, HT, and Forbes.
Exactly. Plus some really fascinating geopolitical insights on BRICS plus and maritime power. So we want to understand exactly why global companies are moving these supply chains out of China, how consecutive trade wars have fundamentally rewired global production, and what strategies companies are adopting to actually survive the future.
Because it's a matter of survival now for a lot of these corporations.
It is. But hey, just to be clear up front for you listening, we are going to be looking at some highly politically charged moves today.
Right. We have to look at the policies to understand the economics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about everything from specific aggressive tariff actions by the Trump administration to, massive naval expansion strategies under President Xi Jinping. And we are not here to take political sides.
Not at all.
Right. We aren't endorsing any of these political viewpoints or strategies. We are strictly here to analyze the data and the corporate strategies as they are reported in our source material. We just want to understand the economic realities on the ground.
Yeah, the focus here is strictly on the mechanisms of global trade. We want to look at the data behind the inflation, the geopolitical logic behind the tariffs, and how corporate behavior is fundamentally adapting.
Okay, so let's jump in. We hear the term trade wars thrown around constantly in the news.
Oh, all the time.
Right. But it usually sounds temporary, like a short-term dispute over steel quotas or soybean exports that eventually gets resolved. But the sources we're looking at point to a deeper structural shift. What exactly is driving this massive supply chain migration route now?
Well, the underlying philosophy driving global trade has just completely fractured. I mean, for decades, the United States and the West generally, they viewed China primarily as a vast manufacturing hub.
Right, the world's factory.
Exactly. It was this source of incredibly efficient, cheap labor and a massive emerging market for Western goods. The prevailing theory was that, through deep economic integration, everybody wins.
But the data says that era is over.
It is definitively over. Washington no longer views China merely as a trading partner. The official posture now, according to the analyses, defines China as a systemic strategic competitor.
A systemic strategic competitor. That is a very specific, carefully chosen phrase.
It really is.
It implies the threat isn't coming from outside the house, but from within the foundation itself.
That's the crucial distinction, yeah. The U.S. realizes it can't completely stop China's economic rise.
Right.
And they know they can't isolate China the way they isolated the Soviet Union during the Cold War. China's just simply too deeply embedded at the very center of global trade and manufacturing.
You can't just surgically remove them.
No, you'd crash the entire global economy. So the goal for the U.S. is no longer total containment. The goal is to deliberately slow China's momentum.
Okay, slow it down.
Right? Restrict its access to vital future technologies and essentially just manage the trajectory of its rise.
And the sources refer to this new reality as a cold peace, which makes total sense because it is distinctly different from the Cold War.
Exactly.
In the Cold War, you had two armed ideological camps that were completely economically severed from one another. Today, we have a deeply connected world economy where commerce is just no longer politically neutral.
Yeah, the instruments of conflict have completely changed. They aren't tanks and missiles anymore. They're tariffs, export controls, investment screens, and technology choke points.
So for you listening, it's essentially like a divorced couple that still has to run a highly profitable family business together.
That is a great way to put it.
Right, like they aren't throwing punches in the boardroom because they both need the stock price to stay high, but they are absolutely changing the locks on certain R&D doors and aggressively auditing each other's expenses.
Yeah, they are locked in a relationship of mutual vulnerability. And, you know, the primary weapon of choice in this boardroom brawl has been the tariff.
And the escalation detailed in the economic data is staggering.
Oh, it's huge. Back in 2018 and 2019, we saw the initial shock. The U.S. placed 10 to 25% tariffs on roughly $350 billion worth of Chinese goods.
Which at the time felt massive. I mean, it completely dominated the news cycle.
It did. But fast forward to the data from 2024 and 2025, and the landscape is entirely different. Under the IETA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the U.S. implemented these Liberation Day tariffs.
And those were broad.
Incredibly broad. They implemented a universal baseline tariff of at least 10%, but for China, it pushed tariff rates to near 100% coverage. Almost everything was taxed, with some specific tariffs reaching 125%.
Okay, so the environment became incredibly hostile for free trade. But how did companies actually react on the ground? I mean, did they just eat the costs? Because if I'm a U.S. company and my imported parts from China are suddenly taxed at 125%, my production costs are going to skyrocket.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to have to pass that cost straight to the consumer. So we should have seen massive, crippling inflation in the U.S. in 2025, but we didn't. Why?
Okay, so that is the massive aha moment buried in the CAMA economic working paper. It's fascinating. They compare the data from the 2018-2019 tariff shock to the 2024-2025 escalation.
Okay, what did they find?
Well, in that first episode in 2018, the tariffs hit the U.S. economy hard. U.S. producer price inflation spiked by about 1.4%.
Almost entirely because of those pass-through costs.
Right. Companies were heavily reliant on Chinese inputs, got caught off guard, and just raised prices. But here's the twist. Despite the 2024-2025 tariffs being vastly more aggressive, the inflationary impact was actually less severe.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and the inflation spike dissipated much quicker.
Because between that first shock in 2018 and the massive escalation in 2025, those companies didn't just sit still.
Exactly. They saw the writing on the wall. They executed what the industry calls the China Plus One strategy.
Right, diversifying.
They actively, aggressively diversified their sourcing to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, India, and Mexico. And the data here is stark. China's share of U.S. imports plummeted from 23% in late 2017 down to just 7% by December 2025.
Wait, hold on. Dropping from 23% to 7% is massive.
It is.
But let me push back on that, because are global companies really escaping China entirely? Or is this just a sleight of hand? Like, if I'm buying Chinese components, shipping them to Mexico or Vietnam, and just putting the final screw in there to slap a Made in Mexico sticker on it, I haven't decoupled. I'm just avoiding the tariff.
And your skepticism is completely validated by the sources. The reality of this physical shift is incredibly nuanced.
Okay, so what's really happening?
The part of the process that determines the origin label for tariff purposes, the final assembly, that has absolutely moved.
Which is what saved the U.S. from the inflation spike.
Precisely. But China still utterly dominates the upstream components. So the idea of a total decoupling is practically a myth at this point. The supply chains haven't been severed, they've just become geographically longer and more convoluted.
Yeah, so moving a t-shirt factory to Vietnam is one thing. The materials are simple, but what happens when the product isn't cotton, but like the most advanced technology on Earth?
Right, which brings us to the securitization of supply chains, specifically semiconductors.
The microchips.
Exactly. According to the strategic analyses, tech is the most intense arena of this rivalry. Both the U.S. and China now view the entire semiconductor supply chain strictly as a matter of critical national security.
It's not just commerce anymore.
Not at all. It's about securing the brains inside our power grids, financial servers, and advanced weapons systems. So we're seeing what they call selective decoupling.
Right.
It's not about cutting off all trade. The U.S. isn't trying to stop China from making plastic toys. They're actively fencing off these critical tech sectors using entity lists.
Which are essentially government blacklists.
Right. If a Chinese company is put on an entity list, it blocks them from getting U.S. tech or machinery without a highly restricted license. Plus, the U.S. is using the Cheech FPS Act to force manufacturing back home.
But there's a really surprising detail here from the Forbes source about those blacklists. The U.S. recently prepared to add over 100 Chinese entities to a blacklist all at once.
Right, major systemic players.
Yeah, like the leading Chinese AI firm DeepSeek and their biggest memory chip maker, CXMT. But then Washington suddenly paused. They didn't pull the trigger. Why back off when your stated goal is to fence off the technology?
Because this is a highly calculated game of leverage. The U.S. paused to avoid escalating tensions to a breaking point.
Ah, so they ran the models.
Exactly. Dropping the hammer on over 100 major Chinese tech firms all at once wouldn't just hurt China. It could cause a total systemic rupture that would crash their own economies. It shows how delicate this cold piece is.
It goes right back to that mutual vulnerability. They're trying to apply maximum pressure without blowing up the family business. So, if the U.S. is actively fencing off tech and forcing supply chains to other countries, China can't just be sitting idly by taking these hits. How are they adapting their own supply chains?
Well, to absorb the shock, China is executing a massive strategic pivot. And the Coface report outlines this perfectly. They are pivoting inward, leaning heavily on their domestic market.
And the number here is astonishing.
It really is 81%.
Yeah, 81% of Chinese industrial companies' revenue actually comes from domestic sales within China. We always think of China as this relentless export machine dependent on the U.S. consumer, but direct exports to the U.S. are only about 2.7% of their total industrial revenue.
Right, so their absolute first line of defense is their own massive population, stimulating domestic demand to keep the factories running.
But they still need global influence, and they still need raw materials. They can't just close their borders.
No, and that is where the BRICS Plus data comes in. China is aggressively using the expanded BRICS bloc, which now includes the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and others, to build an alternative economic order.
And China is completely dominating this bloc's manufacturing, right?
Overwhelmingly, they account for 83.8% of all manufacturing exports within the BRICS Plus network. They are providing the machinery and electronics in exchange for energy and raw materials.
But there is a major catch mentioned in the sources, a glaring vulnerability.
Right.
BRICS Plus doesn't have a complete internal supply chain.
Exactly. That's their Achilles heel. They still heavily rely on G7 countries for core production equipment and capital goods.
The machine that makes the machine?
Yes. If China wants to build a state-of-the-art factory to supply the BRICS network, they still desperately need the highly specialized robotic arms and milling machines made in Germany or Japan.
And that vulnerability extends right out onto the physical trade routes, too. If you are importing all your oil from the UAE and exporting finished goods to Brazil to bypass the U.S., you have to physically move those goods across the ocean.
Which brings us to the maritime power analysis. To secure its remaining global supply lines, China is rapidly building the world's largest naval fleet.
Dubbed the Great Wall of China at sea.
Right, because they import 80% of their oil via sea and rely on maritime routes for 90% of their foreign trade.
So if your rival controls the shipping lanes, your entire alternative economy can be choked out with a blockade.
Exactly. That is why protecting the South China Sea and controlling the first island chain, which centers on Taiwan, is vital. It's a non-negotiable mechanism of their new supply chain strategy.
Wow. Okay, so if we pull back, the U.S. is friendshoring, China is pivoting to BRICS Plus and building a massive navy. Where does this leave the rest of the world and future corporate strategies?
Well, according to the Anadolu Ajansa and Yetkin reports, we are moving from a unipolar world to what they call co-hegemonic bipolarity.
Co-hegemonic bipolarity. Okay, what does that mean for a company making laptops or cars?
It means the future production model is built entirely on friendshoring, moving production to geopolitical allies, and nearshoring, which is moving production geographically closer, like from China to Mexico.
Right, to avoid those oceanic shipping risks.
Exactly. But what's really fascinating is how the middle powers are reacting.
Yeah, the rest of the world isn't just sitting still.
No. Regions like Turkey, Asian countries, India, Mexico, they are playing a complex game of hedging.
Hedging your bets.
Right. They are acting as the new hubs for these rerouted supply chains. They're taking all these manufacturing jobs leaving China, and they benefit from this new world disorder by remaining flexible.
Right, because they don't want to exclusively align with either the U.S. or China. So Mexico, for instance, will happily take billions in Chinese foreign direct investment to build factories.
Exactly.
But then they export those finished goods to the U.S. under the USMCA Free Trade Agreement, completely bypassing the U.S. tariffs on China.
It's brilliant. They are charging a toll to both superpowers.
So my takeaway for you listening, if you are running a global company today, efficiency and cheap labor are no longer your top priorities.
Not at all.
Resilience, redundancy, and geopolitics are. You have to physically design a supply chain that can survive a tariff tweet, an export ban on a critical microchip, or a naval blockade in a contested strait.
You're optimizing for survival in a weaponized economic world.
And that wraps up our deep dive. The global supply chain has been permanently altered. The era of pure, unpolitical globalization is officially over, replaced by a cold peace where trade is a strategic weapon, and companies have literally had to redraw the map of global production just to survive.
It's a profound new landscape.
It really is. But before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. We've spent this time talking about how companies are physically moving human-operated factories to places like Mexico and Vietnam to avoid the crossfire.
Right.
But as AI and automation get cheaper and smarter every day, will the next China plus one strategy even involve moving to a new country? Or will companies just replace overseas human supply chains entirely with fully automated, local, robotic microfactories right in their own backyards?
Yeah.
Think about what that means for the future of global trade. Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.